my name is Amara, and I'm the Interfaith and Spiritual Diversity Cozy at the MICA office, Multicultural Involvement and Community Advocacy. I use she, her, hers pronouns. Today I have with me Dr. Carlton Green, and we're going to be talking a little bit about all the stress that minorities face. So, given coronavirus, a lot of students have been facing an unprecedented amount of extra stress. But minorities already face a lot of extra stress in their lives. And so that's why I've got Dr. Carlton Green here with me to talk about this issue. Dr. Green?
Thanks for having me, Amara. I really appreciate it. I'm Dr. Carlton Green. I am the Director of Diversity Training and Education at the University of Maryland in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. I use he, him, and his pronouns. I am a counseling psychologist by training. Prior to taking on this role, I was a staff psychologist in the University Counseling Center for about 5 years. And probably for, now that I'm saying this out loud, for probably the past 30 years or so, I've been on a college campus, but certainly as a professional person or a graduate student for the past 25 years. And so here today, being able to have this conversation with Amara is really a treat as we think about how different people or minoritized people are actually being affected, not only just in general, but by the COVID-19 pandemic.
So there is actually a theory, because there's been a lot of academic research about how minorities in general are impacted by stress, and it's called minority stress theory. So can you tell me a little bit about what minority stress theory is and what kind of goes into it?
Sure. Certainly as a psychologist, we certainly talk a little bit about this in our work with clients, and specifically a lot of it has been written to pertain to the lives of LGBTQ folks. But a psychiatric epidemiologist in California actually came up with this theory. And it's really a way of being able to help us understand how the experiences of hate and discrimination and prejudice affect the lives of minoritized people. And a lot of the work really started with thinking about the lives of sexual orientation and gender minority folks. But what we know is that this is a theory that could probably apply to the experiences of other minoritized populations. And when I use that word, I'm really thinking about folks who have historically not had access to resources in this country, or who have been, because of our country's history and legal and social processes, have been minoritized and left out of the mainstream conversation. But in thinking about minority stress theory, what Dr. Meyer out at UCLA currently was thinking about was really about the unique experiences that minoritized people have, in addition to the stress that we already have. What are the unique aspects of stress that we have? So minority stress is sort of like an addition to the number of stressors that we already experience. And they're experienced by people, and it feels really stigmatizing for people, because they have to not only figure out how to adapt to the stress that they experience that everybody else does, but we have to adapt to the minority stress that we experience. He also talks about how it is a chronic experience, in terms of it is just sort of like this underlying pervasive experience that's always present. It's not you have like this flare up of something, although we can see that, right? If you think about the police shootings of unarmed Black people in this country, right? So we had a time period where that was just happening in the news every day. Although we do know that has been something that's been happening chronically in this country for a while. And then the other piece that he talked about is that it's socially based, in terms of it's related to sort of like the social processes and institutions and structures that people have to engage with. And so it's not just in terms of stress being this biological experience that we have, but it's about this interaction that we have with the world around us that really creates this experience. So it's additive, it's unique, it's chronic, and it's in addition to the stress that people already experience as a result of just being human beings.
Yeah, I know when I was first reading about this theory, I kind of had this misconception that it was the environment that's exactly causing or that's leading to the stress, but I would describe it more as like the environment is causing additional stress for minorities, and it accrues over time, and so that leads to health problems. So if you were in a country or in an environment where you're not the minority anymore, you might face like different stressors than if you go to an environment where you are the minority.
Right.
So I know that a lot of the research was originally applied to the LGBTQ community, but this can definitely be applied to even women who are minorities in certain areas, or like religious minorities, or if there's any other groups that you can think of.
Hmm. Yeah, I would say, even as you're saying it, it's not even just that it possibly apply to women, but we think of women as being the minoritized gender. But if you think about trans and non-binary people,
Mhm.
certainly being minoritized with regards to gender identity. I think that there are also ways that we could think about this with people who are from different or from under-resourced social classes. So like lower class people or working class people. If you begin to think in terms of people who have disabilities, right? How it is that these processes play out for them is hugely, for many of us, it's hugely the same, right? Even if we talk about the processes of minority stress theory, that actually helps us understand a little bit more. Dr. Meyer really pointed out there's this sort of like this chronic and acute um, people experience chronic and acute prejudice related events. And so if you think about people with disabilities or immigrant students, it's certainly possible, especially in the current climate, that we could see that people have these bouts of or these engagements with discrimination that really affect them, their how they see themselves, how they feel about themselves. It affects their health, right?
Mhm.
There's also the expectation of minority stress and the vigilance that comes around that. So if we're thinking about in terms of if I am a queer person, right, and I'm going to go into a space where I know that it's usually dominated by heterosexual people,
Mhm.
having the expectation or the anticipation that somebody will treat me differently or somebody might discriminate against me because I am a queer person, that's a part of minority stress. Then there's also the internalization of negative attitudes about yourself as a minoritized person. So to be thinking in terms of Black students who come to college campuses who may not think that they're as smart as other students.
Mhm.
That's one way of sort of like internalizing that. Or women who are in STEM related fields who don't think that they are as good at math or as good at science, right? Another way of internalizing it. And then specifically with regards to sexual orientation, there's the concealment or the decision about whether or not you will come out or you will keep it private or keep it to yourself, uh,
Mhm.
that you are a sexual minority person, right? And so there's a lot of work that goes into making sure that you don't allow this part of yourself to be seen by other people, which in and of itself is just stressful, right?
Right.
So those four processes really also get us into thinking about who could be, who the theory could apply to. And again, across the board, we see that minoritized people experience most of these processes. You can think about it in so many other ways too, especially if there are aspects of your identity that are not readily apparent to people.
Mhm.
Think about a person who is a religious minority, um,
Mhm.
like a Jewish person or a Muslim person, for whom maybe they have made some decisions about not necessarily wearing traditional garments that go along with their religion, right? And so they may conceal part of that or have to come to a place where they need to decide whether or not they're going to share that with other people. That is stressful for
Mhm.
people. Um, and so we could probably talk about so many other aspects of identity where it plays out. But you're right, especially in our college setting, where we know that a lot of students come to actually find and explore different parts of their identities, which is really in service of their becoming the best person that they're going to be or the most mature person that they're going to be. And to sort of have to have minority stress applied to your life means too that maybe your growth could be stunted as well. But we also recognize that many minoritized people adapt to the situations that they're in.
Mhm. So I know that oftentimes in minorities, we have a lot of stereotypes. So we could have the model minority, which is oftentimes applied to Asian Americans being this perfect minority or being held to this additional standard. Another common one that I've seen a lot is like the angry Black woman trope.
Mhm.
How are these stereotype labels extra harmful, and how can they contribute to minority stress?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, if we are categorizing or stereotyping different groups of minoritized people and expecting them to conform to those stereotypes, and punishing them when they deviate from those stereotypes, right? That in and of itself is a stressor. But if
Mhm.
you think about, if we use the Asian American model minority myth, right, is that we're not necessarily allowing for uh, the plethora or the diversity within Asian American communities to evidence itself, and we might overlook people who are struggling. Or, like when I was in the counseling center, one of the things that was really common is that there were Asian and Asian American students who would come in and say, my parents wanted me to be X. I don't really want to be that. And so I want to choose another major, right? And so all these expectations that we can put on people, especially around stereotypes, what ends up happening is that we create stress for them. And then not only do we create stress, but we don't allow them to express themselves differently than the stereotype, which too is stressful, right? And so your body really takes on, your body takes a toll when you're not able to work through these stressors. And so, there can be mental health issues, there can be behavioral health issues. But to come back to your point, so like asking people to live within the confines of these stereotypes can be extremely stressful because we're not encouraging people to fully grow or to fully develop. And well, we're not going to talk about dominant groups here. But my point is that none of us were really meant to be a stereotype. We were all meant to actually be so like a unique person who might inhabit a lot of different cultural characteristics, but the combination of those characteristics really produces a unique individual. And being limited to a stereotype actually limits your potential for growth and to be a whole person, which again is pretty stressful.
Yeah, I want to move on a little bit to, we're living in April 2020 and coronavirus is all around the news around us, and it can be very stressful for students, for families, for everyone. And this can cause additional stress, not just the already stressful situation it is, but it can cause additional stress for minorities in particular. So how do you think that what kinds of unique experiences are minorities facing because of this unusual and stressful pandemic already?
Right. I think it really bears repeating that we've heard a lot of people talk about in the news that coronavirus or the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, in and of itself does not discriminate. Like the
Mhm.
virus, the disease does not know any barriers, that it's not necessarily identifying, or it's not there's no genealogical part to this that's targeting a certain type of genes or something like that. So the virus itself is not discriminating. What we do know, though, and this is really where minority stress theory comes in, is that there are discriminatory and biased systems that we all live in that
Mhm.
would exacerbate this pandemic that we're living in. Right? We hear repeatedly in the news that Black people and Brown people are dying at significantly higher rates than white people, or especially in comparison to um, the proportion of society that we make up, right?
Mhm.
And so what we know is that there are a lot of social determinants out there that are really affecting the lives of people of color, or students of color, right? So we'll talk about Black people for instance, right? Black people and brown people too. I should think about it that way. And poor people historically have lived in areas where um, they are underfunded for resources with regards to municipal or civic resources, water, roads, things like that. And so there's less attention paid to these communities, less resources planted in those places. We know that a lot of Black and brown people work in what we consider so like these frontline essential jobs,
Mhm.
and you need to be able to go to work at this point, or you have to go to work at this point in order to be able to provide for your family, or in order to be able to keep your job, right? So even as we're hearing people say, stay at home, or Black and brown people need to stop smoking or start moving their bodies, that actually doesn't have anything to do with right now when a person has to go out to a job and be exposed to other people who may have the virus. We know that, people with a lot of pre-existing health conditions are vulnerable to this disease, and we know that things like diabetes and high blood pressure are rampant in minoritized communities. We also know, we've read a little bit about how and I don't know that this is still standing to be true, that people who smoke might be more at risk for the disease. And we know that
Mhm.
poor people have higher smoking rates in their communities than other people. So it's not being queer that makes you susceptible to the disease. It's the fact that you are a smoker, right?
Right.
And it's that smokers are could be disproportionately prevalent in queer communities. So it's these social issues that actually exacerbate what happens for people. And if we go a little bit further and thinking about when a Black or a brown person shows up to the doctor, or a queer person shows up to the doctor, we also know that physicians don't necessarily do the types of thorough check-ins with Black and brown clients, or with queer clients, or with poor clients that
Mhm.
they could be doing, right, in order to be able to catch the disease. If we go back to even the thing that you were bringing up before, like the strong Black woman or the angry Black woman, right? A Black woman goes into a medical facility and talks about feeling some type of pain or having something that could be consistent with COVID-19, and the doctor might actually overlook that because of the way doctors are actually trained to think, or part of their socialization is to be thinking that Black people don't experience pain, or they don't experience illness the same way that white people do, right? And so things get overlooked, and that's how Black and brown and other minoritized communities end up suffering more as a result of COVID-19. And so think even that alone, right? There's some discrimination built into our systems that actually results in much more negative health outcomes for minoritized folks.
Yeah, I think it's very unfortunate because although coronavirus is not very fatal for the majority, I would say, a lot of people do end up coming out of it. There are definitely certain populations that are more vulnerable. If you have disabilities, you may be more vulnerable to the virus. And then definitely just catching the virus if you are of a certain demographic, because of your environmental circumstances, you're more likely to catch it. And I know that I was reading an article about a Black man. He's like afraid to wear a mask because there can be a lot of social stigma around Black people covering up, and it has led to a lot of police violence and a lot of discrimination. And so to kind of choose between, am I going to put my physical safety at risk because of coronavirus, or because of police brutality or other social discrimination that could occur? And
Mm-hmm.
it's tough decisions that people are unfortunately having to make now.
Mm-hmm. And interestingly, to point out, even because that's a great example, to point out the fact that you have to consider whether or not you wear the mask or not.
Mm-hmm.
You are going to be viewed by the police as somebody who is more suspect of some type of dangerous or criminal behavior or not, right? That is where we see additive stress. So
Mm-hmm.
COVID-19 is already stressful for all of us, but to be a Black person or a brown person who's making the decision about wearing a mask, that's where the additive stress comes in, because we
Right.
go out into public and we could encounter the police and we could actually die, right? And so other communities are not necessarily having to think about that. So it's a really good example of what the additive and unique and maybe even chronic stressors are for folks.
Well, I know that we could talk about this forever because there's so many examples of how coronavirus has kind of brought to light a lot of these inequalities, but I want to talk about students in particular. So what kinds of inequalities has COVID-19 highlighted for the student population, especially here at UMD?
Mm-hmm. Some students' homes, it's not a conducive environment for learning.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not people are living in a space where they are in a caretaking role, right, for their younger siblings, or they have to go back and they go to work in order to be able to support their family. Some homes, whether or not that is about socioeconomic status, or it's about racial status, or it's about being in a rural area, right, or being like in a working class neighborhood. Students may have to be taking on additional responsibilities that other middle class students may not have to take on at the same
Mm-hmm.
time. And so it's an additive stress for people. There is the stress of maybe not having access to the internet or the technology that you need in order to be able to function as a student right now. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so there are programs out there that are focused on trying to get students access to technology, but we also know that there are homes where that's just not the case, or that it's not a possibility, right? So if you are a if you were raised in a neighborhood that didn't have access to these things, or you don't have a computer to take home from school, right? Because on campus you have access to computers and computer labs, but now you've got to go home and figure out how, not only how to do your work, but how to be engaged through through the World Wide Web, to engage assignments that professors have assigned. It's also another part of the stress. A really unique part of it is that thinking about, and I've heard this a lot on campus too, faculty teaching courses, and they penalize students for not showing their face on video, or they penalize students for not um, uh, being available at the time that the course is being run,
Hmm.
the real time that the course is being run. When it may just be the case, what if I'm at home with 3 or 4 siblings who are also school age people, and we're all having to figure out how to be using one computer, or using sort of like the limited Wi-Fi at my house,
Hmm.
or to be able to log on for coursework. Um, how is it that somebody's going to be upset with me about that and then penalize me for that, when that's just the natural state of what's happening, or that's just the state of my home right now, right? So students who don't have access to the technology and to the resources that they need is a huge piece that I think that we're seeing some disparities around. And then there are also some pieces around how people are being treated in these online spaces. Not only the piece around sort of like, sometimes students don't want to expose their backgrounds, because
Hmm.
they want to conceal that from people, because they don't want people to know where they're living. You know, people do put in a lot of work to keep home and school separate. We're also hearing that, you know, people are being misgendered in these spaces. People's pronouns are not being respected. And, you know, at some institutions, people have said, don't allow people to use the rename function, right? When in all
Oh.
actuality, what we need is for people to be able to use the rename function in order to be able to put their pronouns up, right?
Hmm.
Or to be able to put the name that they have chosen for themselves up. And so there are all these ways that are really exacerbating the pandemic stress, combined with the minority stress that we know a number of minoritized populations are experiencing.
Yeah, I know that another aspect, we've talked a lot about how access to technology, particularly for low income students, but a lot of people who did move back home suddenly went from the campus environment to maybe being with their families, or being living with other people who they weren't living with on campus. And that can pose another set of challenges for students. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I can talk about really 2 instances that I can think of. One, you think about queer students
Hmm.
who are out on campus, but maybe they are not out to their families, right? Or even if they are out to their families, they may not be accepted in their families. So to be back home, where you are not feeling quite as welcome, or not feeling as though you can be all of yourself there. And then maybe you could be taking classes or involved in student groups who are convening these virtual meetings or classes on Zoom, where you need to engage in conversation about that aspect of yourself, but also knowing that that could be really unhealthy at home, right? That can be a really stressful experience for people. So to be thinking about being in a class where somebody's expecting you to talk about being a queer person, right? And you got people around, that could be really, really extremely stressful for folks. And so to be thinking about how is it that you can navigate that a little bit differently would be a huge challenge for a student. We also think about, and I was just participating in or viewing a webinar yesterday where some of my colleagues were talking about this, to be a maybe specifically an Asian or an Asian American person who goes home, back to, you know, where maybe your traditional, where your parents live, and they are embracing traditional values, and maybe at school you have begun to rethink some things around who you want to be, or how it is that you're going to show up as an Asian or Asian American person. And now you've got these potential, you know, different political views clashing in the home. Or you go back home and there are generations, right? You know, maybe your grandmother, your grandfather, or your great aunt or your great uncle also lived there, right? So you
Mhm.
got this intergenerational family setup occurring there, and it could be the case that again, how a student shows up in their Asian nest or their Asian American nest may be different from from the generations at home, and that too can be difficult with regards to figuring out how do I navigate this, how do I talk about this with my parents while I'm here in this stressful time, how do I respect my parents, but also how do I maintain some integrity for myself, especially as my views might be evolving. So being back in a space where your identity, where you've been growing your identity at school, and then being back in a space where maybe the expectations around who you are, how you show up are different. That's also another piece of stress that could be for any student. Don't get me wrong,
Mhm.
but we know from minoritized populations, it's often the case that people come to the college campus and they explore in ways that when they go home, it can feel somewhat stifled.
So I know we've talked a lot about all of these challenges that minorities face, and minority students in particular. Do you have any advice for students that might feel like they have the deck kind of stacked against them?
Yeah, it's a really this is a tricky time for minoritized folks, right? Um, a couple of things that come to mind immediately, and you could even be thinking about them in sort of like different domains. If you think about sort of like your relational domain, you got to figure out how to make sure that you maintain connections with people who feed this aspect of who you are relationally. Whether or not, so if you're thinking about, just like you were talking about, being involved with student groups
Mm-hmm.
that sort of like nurture who you are, support who you are, figuring out how to maintain those connections, even though we are physically distancing from each other, is hugely important. Whether or not that is you stepping outside to call people or to use technology if you have access to that, or if we need to be thinking about doing some old school things by like writing letters or something like that, right? Figuring out how to still be in contact with the people who offer you relational support is hugely important. I was just talking about this other one with some people today, right? One of the things that we know really helps with managing and coping with sort of like negative moods and negative perceptions of yourself is to move your body, whether or not that is about dancing or it's about going out to do some exercise or if it's, doing some push ups at home. Whatever it is, move your body. When your body is moving, it actually produces the types of neurochemicals that are necessary for fighting off negative mood, right?
Mm-hmm.
So move your body. That becomes really important. I think that there's a piece around be very aware of what it is that you are feeding your mind at this point. It could be really important to limit your television viewing or to limit the amount of information that you're taking in about COVID-19 because it can be really distressing, especially as a minoritized person, when we're
Mm-hmm.
hearing about the disproportionate rates at which we are being negatively affected. Um, or, I have a colleague, Dr. Miriam Jernigan, who talks a little bit about this. Even if you are somebody who needs the news, right? Maybe you figure out how to rely on somebody else who is really good at taking in the news and distilling the important facts from it and giving it to you, so that you don't have to be exposing yourself to that. That can also be hugely important. You just got to figure out how to minimize the amount of information that you take in. I think that there's also a way of thinking about this spiritually and religiously. Just because we are physically distancing ourselves from each other does not mean that we are necessarily distancing ourselves from our religious and spiritual communities.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to figure out how to maintain our spiritual practices or our faith practices at this time, using Zoom or using again, sort of like apps to be able to be engaged with spiritual communities. I think there was a point. Well, I shouldn't say there was. For me personally, I have a group of friends from my hometown. Sometimes we engage in virtual Bible studies
Mm-hmm.
where we might share the same devotional over a course of a 7-day period or something like that. So we're reading the same thing and then we get to type in the comments. So we're still engaged in a community that way. Um, and I think that the other piece academically really is to recognize that we are living in a different time. You're not going to be able to produce the way that you have been producing in the past, maybe while you were on campus. And you've got to figure out how to give yourself some grace around this current situation while also recognizing that you are still a smart, intelligent, capable person, right?
Mhm.
Just because you're not producing the same amount or producing the volume that you were producing when you were on campus does not mean that you are any less smart, any less capable, any less intelligent. You are still the same person who is now homeschooling basically in the midst of a pandemic. Things will be different, right? So getting into a place where you can accept that things are different will be really useful for students, and also considering how do you still have high expectations of yourself to get your work done or to be engaged in class, and figuring out how to communicate when you're struggling, communicating that to your instructors when you're struggling, because many actually I am hearing this that some instructors are recognizing that students are struggling and they are trying to figure out ways to be more emotionally supportive of students. One of the ways that I definitely think people should be thinking about this is, what is this pandemic giving you the opportunity to learn about yourself?
Mhm.
What is it giving you the opportunity to heal about yourself, right? I actually heard a speaker make reference to that last week in a webinar. This is a real opportunity for us, not necessarily an opportunity where I'm saying like, be positive, you're going to get through it, it's all going to work out great. That's not that I'm not that type of person at all. But I am the type of person who is saying like, what is this moment trying to teach me? What is this moment trying to help me to be better at? Or how is this moment trying to change me, right? And I think that if we can begin to bring a meaning making lens to this, that even as we are minoritized people, right, we are actually going to come out better on the other side.
Mhm.
And I mean, I think certainly not to belittle or to, well, I'm just going to say this. I think that minoritized people also have real strengths when it comes to figuring out how to grow from adversity.
Mhm.
And there's a history of so many minoritized peoples in the history of this country. So that's also a piece that we have to be asking ourselves. How will we use the strengths of our ancestors, whatever minoritized group that we have found ourselves to be a part of? How will we use the strength and wisdom that they have manifested in the past to apply this to this current moment and keep moving forward?
Hope we're able to actually make some positive change from this awful situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Green, I want to thank you so much for taking time to be with me today. It was a very insightful conversation, and I hope that everyone learned a little bit more about the stress that minorities face in particular and how it can be even more during this pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for having me, Amara. You were a great host. You've been great
Oh,
in
thanks.
collaborating and building this, and you are. Thank you for your insights and your contributions. I've really enjoyed this conversation with you.
Well, thank you, everyone.